My sister and I finished medical school together, but our parents paid off her student loans while ignoring my costs. She deserves it more, honey. When they attended her debt-free celebration, they had a little surprise waiting. Before we begin the story, take a moment to support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support means the world to our channel and helps us spread more shocking, true stories to light. Now, let's get started. The bitter realization. She deserves it more, honey. Mom didn't even look up from the gourmet cupcakes she was meticulously arranging on the tier display stand. Her voice was casual, dismissive, like she was discussing something as trivial as dinner plans, not my entire future. Jessica has always been more dedicated to her studies. You've always had other interests. The words hit harder than a slap. I stood there, frozen in my parents' kitchen, my medical school diploma still fresh in its frame, my fingers gripping its edges like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Mom, we both graduated with honors. We had the exact same GPA. I tried to keep my voice steady, but my hands betrayed me, trembling slightly. I wasn't just confused, I was hurt. I don't understand. Why would you and Dad pay off all of Jessica's loans, but not mine? Mom sighed, finally sparing me a glance, her expression a mix of mild disappointment and impatience. Audrey, your sister doesn't have a wealthy mentor like Dr. Fleming taking an interest in her future. You've always had advantages Jessica didn't. I almost laughed. Advantages? Dr. Vivian Fleming wasn't some fairy godmother who had waved a wand over my life. She was my research advisor, a position I had earned through brutal 80-hour weeks in the lab while Jessica was off skiing in Aspen with our parents. My advantage had been working myself to exhaustion, while my twin sister basked in the warmth of their unwavering emotional and financial support. So, I'm being punished for finding my own mentorship opportunities? I try to keep my voice even, but the weight of their words pressed down on my chest. Dad walked in then, placing a hand on Mom's shoulder. His tone was steady, rehearsed. No one's punishing you, Audrey. We're just being practical. Your sister needs more help than you do. You've always been more resourceful. Resourceful. The same word they'd used as an excuse when they skipped my undergraduate research presentations but flew across the country for Jessica's volleyball tournaments. The justification for why she got a brand new car on her 20th birthday, while I got a gas station gift card. Tomorrow was Jessica's big, debt-free celebration. My parents' idea, of course. They'd invited extended family, her friends, even some of our former professors. The invitations read, celebrating Jessica's achievement, as if graduating medical school without debt had been her accomplishment rather than their financial decision. I need to go, I finally said, grabbing my bag. Early shift at the hospital tomorrow. Will you still make it to Jessica's party? For the first time, Mom's voice held a note of concern. Not for me, but for how my absence might affect my sister's big moment. I'll be there. The words felt bitter in my mouth. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Fleming. Need to speak with you urgently about the Patterson Fellowship. Big news. I stared at the screen, a cold realization settling over me. My parents' favoritism wasn't just unfair, it was about to become publicly humiliating. And there was nothing I could do to stop what was coming. A lifetime of being second. Jessica and I had been on oddly divergent paths since birth. I arrived first. She followed 6 minutes later. According to family lore, I had been the quiet one, calm, observant, while Jessica had come into the world with strong, healthy cries, demanding attention from the very first breath. Maybe that was the moment everything was set in motion. Growing up in Cleveland, Jessica was the outgoing twin, the one who made friends easily, the one who excelled at sports. Our parents adored that about her. They attended every one of her soccer games, every dance recital, every tournament. Me? I spent my childhood buried in books, fascinated by everything from astronomy to zoology. I lived in the library, devouring knowledge the way Jessica devoured attention. When I won science fairs, the most I got was a half-hearted "good job, Audrey." Maybe a pat on the head, if they remembered. By high school, the pattern was firmly in place. When we both announced we wanted to become doctors, our parents were thrilled. For Jessica. For me? They sat me down for a serious talk about whether I could handle the pressure. Medical school isn't just about being smart, Audrey, Dad had said, frowning. It takes grit, determination. Jessica has always pushed herself harder. The irony had been painful. During undergrad at Ohio State, I maintained a perfect GPA while working part-time to cover my expenses. Jessica? She struggled. She needed tutors for organic chemistry and physics, expensive ones that our parents paid for without hesitation. When she failed the MCAT the first time, they shelled out thousands for an exclusive prep course. When I scored in the 98th percentile on my first attempt. That's nice, dear. Despite everything, I never resented Jessica. She was my sister, my twin, and I loved her. She hadn't created our parents' favoritism. She had just benefited from it. Sometimes, I even wondered if she felt uncomfortable with their obvious preference. But if she did, she never said a word. We both got into the same medical school in Michigan. For 4 years, we studied side by side, supported each other through grueling rotations, and celebrated each other's successes. I hoped, prayed, that maybe this would finally be the moment our parents saw us as equals. Instead, they just found new ways to elevate Jessica while diminishing me. When I was selected to present my research at a national conference, Jessica coincidentally received an award for community service that same weekend. Guess which event our parents attended? Then, in our final year, something changed. Dr. Vivian Fleming, a renowned neurosurgeon, took notice of my research on pediatric traumatic brain injuries. Under her mentorship, I flourished. For the first time, I had someone who saw me, who recognized my potential, not despite my quiet nature, but because of it. You have a gift for research, Audrey, Dr. Fleming had told me once. You see patterns others miss. That kind of insight can't be taught. If only my parents could see me the way she did. But they never had. And I was finally beginning to realize they never would. The news that changed everything. The morning of Jessica's debt-free celebration, I met Dr. Fleming in her office. She was a striking woman, mid-60s, silver hair pulled back neatly, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. Her office walls were covered in framed awards, published research, and photos of her standing alongside some of the most brilliant minds in medicine. I sat across from her desk, my hands clenched in my lap. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, hoping, praying for good news. Dr. Fleming folded her hands and looked at me, her expression unreadable. Audrey, the committee has made their decision on the Patterson Fellowship. My heart stopped. The Patterson Fellowship at Johns Hopkins, the single most prestigious neurosurgical research position in the country. Only one graduating medical student in the entire nation would be awarded it. I held my breath. Then, Dr. Fleming broke into a broad smile. Congratulations, Dr. Audrey Collins. You got it. I let out a choked laugh, disbelief crashing over me in waves. I don't know what to say. Say that you'll pack your bags for Baltimore, she said with a knowing smile. It was mine. The fellowship. The opportunity of a lifetime. My research on neurovascular regeneration after traumatic brain injuries, the work I had poured my soul into, had set me apart. The committee had been especially impressed with my dual approach, combining surgical innovation with pharmacological intervention. Then came the words that made my stomach twist. The fellowship comes with a generous stipend, housing allowance, and, most importantly, complete loan forgiveness. Debt-free, just like Jessica, except I had earned it. I swallowed hard, my mind already racing ahead to what this would mean when my parents found out. Dr. Fleming watched me carefully. There's more, she continued. I've been invited to Jessica's celebration tonight. Your parents extended an invitation to faculty, not realizing, of course, that you and I are so closely connected. I stiffened. I didn't like where this was going. I'd like to announce the fellowship there, if you're comfortable with that. My stomach twisted. Dr. Fleming, I don't know. It's supposed to be Jessica's night. My parents will see it as me trying to steal her spotlight. Her expression hardened slightly. Audrey, I've observed your family dynamic for 2 years. I've seen your parents at hospital events, heard how they speak about you compared to Jessica. I understand your hesitation, but sometimes she leaned forward, her voice firm, recognition needs to be public to be acknowledged at all. She was right. If my parents heard about the fellowship privately, they'd downplay it. They'd find a way to make it seem like I had just gotten lucky. I took a slow breath. Okay, I nodded. You can announce it. As I walked out of her office, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica. Mom's going overboard for tonight. It's embarrassing. Wish she put this much effort into celebrating both of us graduating. See you there. Red heart. I stopped in my tracks. Jessica had never acknowledged the imbalance before. Before I could even process it, another text came through. This time from my mother. Don't forget, business casual for tonight. And please, let your sister have her moment. This is very important to her. The contrast between the two messages made my stomach churn. Maybe I had been wrong about Jessica all along. And maybe tonight would reveal the truths my parents had been avoiding for 26 years. The celebration that wasn't meant for me. Jessica's debt-free celebration was being held at an upscale restaurant in downtown Detroit. Our parents had rented out the entire rooftop terrace, a level of extravagance that must have cost thousands. The moment the elevator doors slid open, I was greeted by a massive banner that read, "Congratulations, Dr. Jessica." There was no mention of me. I swallowed the familiar sting of disappointment and smoothed down my navy blue dress, taking a steadying breath. This is Jessica's night. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, trying to push away the resentment clawing in my chest. Then I heard her voice. Audrey. Jessica broke away from a group of relatives and rushed over, looking effortlessly stunning in a silver cocktail dress. Her blonde hair, identical to mine in color, was cut into a stylish bob, while I had always kept mine long. She grinned, linking her arm through mine. Thank God you're here. Aunt Patty has already asked me 5 times if I have a boyfriend yet. I let out a small laugh despite the tightness in my stomach. What did you tell her? That I'm married to medicine. But if she knows any eligible neurosurgeons, I'm taking applications. I smiled, but before I could respond, Jessica lowered her voice. Seriously, though, this is ridiculous. Mom invited half the medical school. Dean Wilson is here. I followed her gaze across the terrace, and, sure enough, spotted the dean deep in conversation with our father. Wow. They really went all out. Jessica scoffed. To all out. It's mortifying. And why just for me? We both graduated. We both worked our asses off. For the first time, the knot in my stomach loosened slightly. Maybe Jessica was more aware than I'd given her credit for. Audrey, Jessica. Our mother appeared beside us, champagne in hand, cutting our conversation short. Jessica, the Hendersons just arrived. You remember Thomas Henderson, the chief of surgery at Cleveland Memorial? You should definitely come say hello. She reached for Jessica's arm, effectively pulling her away. Then she turned to me with a polite but dismissive smile. Audrey, could you check with the caterers about the gluten-free options? Your cousin Beth is being difficult about her diet again. And just like that, I was demoted to catering management while Jessica was paraded in front of hospital administrators. Some things never changed. I was still reeling when I spotted Dr. Fleming arriving. She looked effortlessly elegant in a crimson pantsuit, commanding attention just by existing. Audrey, she said warmly, embracing me. Are you ready for our announcement? I hesitated. I'm not sure, I admitted. The timing feels complicated. Dr. Fleming's gaze swept across the terrace, taking in the details, the massive banner with only Jessica's name, the cake that read congratulations, Dr. Jessica, the slideshow playing in the background that featured mostly Jessica, with only the occasional glimpse of me. She exhaled slowly, more complicated than I realized. Across the terrace, I saw my parents introducing Jessica to Dr. Margaret Wu, the chief neurosurgeon at Detroit Medical Center, the same hospital I had applied to for residency. My stomach twisted. Were they trying to secure Jessica a spot through personal connections? Before I could even process that thought, my father's voice cut through the crowd. Dr. Fleming, what an honor to have you here. I turned just in time to see my parents approaching, Jessica trailing behind them. My mother plastered on a smile. We understand you've done some work with Audrey. Dr. Fleming's expression remained perfectly polite, but I saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes. Some work? She repeated. Audrey has been my primary research partner for 2 years. Her contributions to our study on traumatic brain injuries were instrumental to its success. My parents exchanged a glance when I couldn't quite decipher. "How nice," my mother said vaguely. Jessica has also been very involved in neurosurgical research. In fact, Dr. Wu was just saying how impressed she is with Jessica's application to her program. I stiffened. Jessica had never done neurosurgical research. Her focus had always been neuropsychiatry, an entirely different field. Were my parents seriously trying to misrepresent her experience to secure her a residency spot? Dr. Fleming's expression remained composed, but I saw the glint of steel behind her smile. "Is that so?" she said smoothly. "How fascinating." I was under the impression that Jessica's focus was psychiatric applications rather than surgical interventions. An awkward silence settled between us. I clenched my fists at my sides, my jaw tightening. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was deliberate. They were lying about Jessica's experience, possibly at the expense of my own future. And I had had enough. A celebration turned reckoning. Dinner had begun, and as expected, Jessica was seated at the head table, right beside our parents, our grandparents, and Dr. Wu. Me? I was placed at a secondary table, tucked away with cousins and distant family friends. Close enough to hear the conversation at the main table, but not part of it. I barely touched my food. My father's voice carried across the terrace, warm and animated. "We always knew Jessica was destined for greatness," he was telling Dr. Wu. "Even as a little girl, she showed such determination. She's always been the ambitious one." Each word felt like a tiny dagger. I forced myself to keep my face neutral, pushing my food around my plate. Across the terrace, Dr. Fleming sat with a group of faculty members, occasionally catching my eye with knowing glances. I knew what she was thinking. I had spent my entire life being erased in Jessica's shadow. And tonight, in front of our entire social and professional circles, my parents were making it clear that nothing had changed. Then, after dessert was served, my father stood and tapped his glass. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate our daughter Jessica's remarkable achievement." The crowd quieted, turning their attention to him. As many of you know, medical school is a grueling journey. To not only graduate, but to do so debt-free is truly something special. Applause rippled through the terrace. I forced my expression to remain neutral. "We are so blessed to have been able to support Jessica throughout her education," my mother added, rising to stand beside my father. "We always believed in investing in her future because we knew she would make us proud." My throat tightened. Investing in her future. Not our futures, just hers. They had made their choice a long time ago. I gripped the edge of the table, my nails digging into the linen. Then, something I never expected happened. Jessica stood. "Actually," she said, clearing her throat. The crowd turned to look at her. "I'd like to say something." Our parents exchanged nervous glances. Jessica turned her gaze to me, her expression unreadable, but her voice steady. "This celebration feels incomplete." A hush fell over the crowd. Jessica inhaled deeply. "Audrey and I both graduated. We both worked incredibly hard. And honestly, her voice grew stronger. Audrey worked even harder because she did it without the support system that I had." Murmurs rippled through the room. Our mother stiffened beside her. "Jessica," she whispered urgently, "this isn't the time." Jessica ignored her. "It's exactly the time." She turned to face the crowd again. "I can't accept recognition that excludes my sister. It's not right, and it never has been." I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. After all these years, Jessica was finally saying it. Publicly. It was both vindicating and heartbreaking. My father quickly recovered, forcing a chuckle. "Of course we're proud of both our girls," he said, his voice overly jovial. "Audrey has done very well too. But tonight is about celebrating Jessica's debt-free achievement, which is a special milestone." Jessica turned to him, shaking her head. "An achievement you facilitated, not one I earned." The tension in the room was unbearable. Then, at the perfect moment, Dr. Fleming rose from her seat. "If I might add something to this conversation?" Her voice cut through the murmurs, effortlessly commanding the room's attention. My parents looked visibly uneasy. This seems like an opportune time to share some exciting news about Audrey that many of you may not be aware of. My heart pounded. Dr. Fleming smiled. Audrey's research on neurovascular regeneration has earned her the Patterson Fellowship at Johns Hopkins. Gasps spread across the terrace. For those unfamiliar, Dr. Fleming continued, this is the single most prestigious research fellowship awarded to a graduating medical student in the country. It comes with full loan forgiveness, a substantial stipend, and the opportunity to work alongside some of the most brilliant minds in neurosurgery. I heard whispers, excited, shocked. Dr. Wu's eyebrows lifted, her gaze snapping toward me with new interest. My parents? They were frozen. Jessica was grinning at me, beaming, not a hint of jealousy in her expression. Dr. Fleming wasn't finished. In fact, she continued smoothly, the selection committee specifically cited Audrey's groundbreaking dual approach methodology, which she developed independently while balancing a full clinical rotation schedule. She turned to my parents, her expression still pleasant, but her words razor sharp. I've had the privilege of mentoring many promising physicians, but rarely have I encountered someone with the level of dedication and brilliance that Audrey consistently demonstrates. The room erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause. Genuine applause. People were turning in their seats to look at me, smiling, nodding with respect. For the first time in my life, I was being seen. My parents remained still, their faces a complicated mix of shock, confusion, and dawning horror as they realized their carefully curated narrative was falling apart. Jessica raised her champagne glass toward me. "Congratulations, sis," she said, clinking her glass against mine. "The Patterson Fellowship. That's incredible. Why didn't you tell me?" I exhaled shakily, still reeling. "I only found out this morning." I swallowed, and I didn't want to overshadow your celebration. Jessica frowned. "Audrey, this ridiculous party was Mom and Dad's idea, not mine. I tried to tell them it was unfair to you, but..." She sighed. "You know how they get when they've made up their minds." I stared at her. "You did?" "Of course I did." Jessica looked almost offended. "Audrey, I know they've treated us differently. I didn't know how to fix it without making things worse." I blinked. For years, I had thought Jessica was oblivious, that she didn't notice. But maybe she had felt it too. Dr. Margaret Wu suddenly approached, her gaze locked onto me. "Dr. Collins," she said smoothly. For a moment, I thought she was talking to Jessica, until I realized her eyes were focused directly on me. "I was very impressed by Dr. Fleming's account of your research. We should discuss whether you'd consider bringing your work to our neurosurgery department instead of Johns Hopkins." I blinked. "That's very flattering, Dr. Wu, but..." "She's already accepted the Patterson," Jessica interjected proudly, throwing her arm around my shoulders. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Dr. Wu smiled. "Well, when you finish your fellowship, keep Detroit in mind. We'd be lucky to have you." I barely processed what was happening. This nightmare of a party had turned into something I never could have predicted. Jessica had my back. The medical community respected me. And for the first time in my life, my parents were being forced to reckon with the reality they had spent decades ignoring. And I'd never felt so free. A conversation long overdue. My parents were approaching. Slowly, hesitantly. But unlike every other time in my life, they weren't the ones being sought out tonight. Guests kept stopping them. Faculty members, old friends, even distant relatives, offering congratulations about me. Not Jessica. Me. For once, they weren't in control of the narrative. And it was unsettling them. Jessica and I watched them weave through the crowd, their faces carefully composed, but undeniably tense. "Ready for this?" Jessica murmured beside me. "Not really," I admitted. Then, they were there. Dad was the first to speak. His voice was measured, trying for warmth but laced with something else, something he couldn't quite mask. "Dr. Fleming certainly had some impressive things to say about you tonight, Audrey." Mom nodded quickly, her smile tight. "The Patterson Fellowship. That's quite an honor." She paused, then added, her tone edged with accusation. "Why didn't you tell us you were even being considered?" I let out a quiet breath. Would it have mattered? I asked, my voice steady. Mom blinked. What do you mean? I said, you've made it very clear where your interests and support lie. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. That's not fair, Audrey, Dad started. No, Jessica interrupted, her voice sharp. It's exactly fair. Our parents turned to her in surprise. We've always treated you both equally, Mom insisted. Jessica let out a hollow laugh. No, you haven't. She looked between them. You paid for my MCAT prep course but told Audrey to use free online resources. You covered my living expenses through medical school while she had to take out extra loans. You showed up to every single one of my sports games, but you skipped her research presentations. Mom's face paled. That's not. It is, I said quietly. Dad exhaled, running a hand down his face. Jessica needed more support, he said. Audrey, you've always been independent. That's a convenient narrative, I replied. But it doesn't explain why you attended every single one of Jessica's milestones but treated mine like footnotes. Jessica crossed her arms. Mom, Dad, I love you both. But you need to hear this. You've spent our entire lives prioritizing me. And I let it happen because I didn't know how to stop it. Mom looked genuinely stunned. Jessica, honey, that's not true. We've always. No. Jessica shook her head. You didn't. And maybe I thought I was the lucky one, but you know what? You actually held me back. You made me dependent on you. Meanwhile, Audrey had to build everything for herself, with no safety net. Dad looked like he wanted to argue, but for the first time, I saw something else flicker across his face. Recognition. Guilt. We love you both, Mom said softly. Maybe, I said, but you haven't treated us like equals. And watches and belated recognition won't change that. Mom flinched. Dad exhaled heavily. I think we should go, he muttered. Jessica and I watched them retreat, still processing, still reeling. Would they change? I didn't know. But for the first time, it wasn't my responsibility to make them. A future that belongs to me. 3 weeks later, I stood in my empty apartment, surrounded by packed boxes, my one-way ticket to Baltimore sitting on the counter. I was leaving. Jessica sat on the windowsill, watching as I sealed the last box of books. I still can't believe you're actually going, she murmured. Detroit won't be the same without you. I smirked. You'll be too busy with your residency to notice I'm gone. Jessica rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. Then, after a long pause, her expression grew serious. I keep thinking about Mom and Dad, she said. What they did, or I guess what they didn't do. I set down the tape dispenser. Jess, you didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do enough right either, she countered. I should have spoken up sooner. I sighed, sitting beside her on the windowsill. It wouldn't have changed anything, I admitted. They decided a long time ago that I was resourceful, and you were the one who needed their support. That's on them, not you. Jessica bit her lip. They're devastated, you know. Mom keeps crying about how you must hate them. And Dad's telling anyone who'll listen about his brilliant daughter at Johns Hopkins, like he personally funded your research. I let out a breathy laugh. Let him, I said, surprising myself with how little it bothered me now. Their approval didn't define me anymore. So what happens now? Jessica asked. With us, I mean. I took her hand and squeezed it. We find our own way forward, without the competition they created between us. Jessica swallowed hard, then nodded. I'd like that. Then, a slow grin spread across her face. Dr. Audrey Collins, Patterson Fellow, she said, nudging me playfully. I'm so damn proud of you, sis. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. The path ahead was uncertain. It would be challenging, demanding, but it was entirely mine to navigate, on my own terms. And that was worth more than anything my parents could have ever given me. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more real-life family dramas. Let me know in the comments what you think about today's story. Was it fair or totally messed up? See you in the next one.